Hey, so I just went to America and I picked up a cold, so my voice sounds weird, but that's okay, because it always sounds weird. Let's fucking talk about some video games, yeah! It's very hard to create a video game without a clear vision. Maybe if you're making a sequel, you can do so without relying too much on brand new ideas and just make a handful of small improvements across the board. But you really do notice the difference when playing a game where someone has put a lot of thought into it. Especially when too many thoughts have been put into it. There's this mad rush to be the next great innovator in the gaming industry. Making money is one thing, but being the trendsetter that others have to catch up to comes with a lot of perks that can help insulate a company or a video game against future problems. This is where you want your creative team to lock themselves in a room and brainstorm like their lives depend on it. And maybe they do. Because a unique concept that can be realistically implemented without too many setbacks is like goddamn gold dust. Because there's a lot of idiots out there apparently. Games that stack up too many ideas and end up toppling over themselves are kind of wonderful actually, because they take risks. There's a nobility to these failures that I can admire while still feeling the need to point them out and put them on display for everyone to laugh at. I think it's very important to ascertain why an ambitious idea didn't quite land as intended, and how difficult it can be to match ambition with an actually satisfying execution, because it hasn't happened all that much. It's the perennial punching above your weight, hoping that everything will work out in the end. It's like if I want to make a video with PewDiePie and all his millions of subscribers, but everything went wrong and I ended up saying something terrible on the internet. There's been way too much of that lately, I'd hate to add to it. Whenever I feel the urge to criticize a game's frenzied ambition, I get a simultaneous, unrelated urge to talk about No Man's Sky for some reason. Contrary to popular belief, I actually don't like talking about this game ever since I got burned out from hearing about No Man's Sky way too much when it first came out, when virtually all the discussion was depressingly negative. It's an obvious candidate for a video like this, since so much was promised, and a premise as ambitious as a fully explorable universe was always likely to fall flat on its face, but, and this may surprise you, I'm kind of okay with where No Man's Sky is in 2019. It's not perfect, and still some way short of the ridiculous adventure game that was being suggested, but the steady additions that have been made over time have made it a fairly decent game now. Not quite the perfect redemption story, but I'll take this for now. Though, this just makes me wonder if Spore would have been better if we got similarly important updates. I guess we'll never know. But actually, I don't think it would have helped. Conceptually, Spore is a little more out there than something more understandable like No Man's Sky or Sea of Thieves, where you know what kind of game needs to be made, it's just a matter of getting there. Fresh from the mind of The Sims creator Will Wright, Spore was a far larger concept in scale where you could design your own alien race and help them evolve from a basic cellular state all the way to space-conquering tyrants. It's a game for people with god complexes and an itch for creation that nothing else in the market can scratch, which I think helped to carry Spore for a lot of people. There aren't a ton of games like this out there even 11 years later. Unfortunately, Spore had a surprising lack of depth considering the scope this game was going for, and for a world that is attempting to be huge and expansive, the actual boots on the ground gameplay is paper thin most of the time. Replaying a full campaign is a slog and not really all that fun until you take off into space, and no matter how many appendages or penises you give your monstrosity, Spore's charm wears off way too quickly. It's maybe telling that Will Wright hasn't made a game since, but he's got a mobile game coming out eventually about creating and controlling the memories of AIs. So I guess some things never change. The main difference between a game like Spore and others like No Man's Sky and Sea of Thieves is that Spore requires a lot more work to get it to a point where people are satisfied with it. As a developer, you've got to be way more disheartened at the fact that the fundamentals are what people have issues with, as opposed to there just not being enough variety in your game. And that's, the idea is good in something like No Man's Sky. The idea in something like Spore, it needs more work. But hey, no one said playing God would be easy. Does anyone remember 2018 and all the memes related to something being the most ambitious crossover event in history? Of course you do. It was very hard to avoid with Avengers and Smash Bros dominating much of pop culture last year. Hey, before that we had House of Mouse and Fuck, that was so good! Oh! As someone who was fortunate enough to get a weird amount of publicity from one, video game crossovers have gotten pretty ambitious in the past, with one of the more striking examples in recent memory being the culmination of everything Resident Evil in the famously not all that great Resident Evil 6. No, it's very exciting, you see, because it's got all your favourite characters from past games in it, and only some of what you might have enjoyed from previous games. Is it possible to both hate and respect a game at the same time? Let's say it is, for the sake of argument, because I do admire what Capcom tried to do with Resident Evil 6 as some kind of grand celebration of the franchise's great history. Problem is, they didn't really stick to the same kind of combination of action and horror that worked so well in the fourth game. Instead, they went completely off the rails and made something which is way too loud and way too stupid. Diagnosing Resident Evil 6's problems is a complicated affair because there are so many different threads you can pull on that all lead somewhere different. Some would point to Capcom's decision to feature more of a cover shooter style of gameplay akin to every other third-person shooter of the time, which resulted in a departure from a lot of what Resident Evil was really good at, with only really Leon's campaign offering a vaguely authentic horror experience. Plus, you could argue that Resident Evil chose the worst time to take itself seriously, and that trying to link all these characters together in a satisfying way was always likely to end in disaster. At the same time though, Resident Evil 6 has an awesome bonus mode that seems to know exactly what kind of game it's in, and offering 3 different campaigns with a 4th waiting to be unlocked later is some pretty incredible value for money, especially considering the current climate. Resident Evil has since turned a corner and veered away from the military aesthetic in favour of a return to the kind of horror that made the series famous in the first place. I'm not sure if Capcom are planning to remake these games all the way back to Resi 6, but I'd love to see them try. Just keep Chris Redfield punching the shit out of that boulder, and you got a deal. I think we idolize individuals in the gaming industry more than we as a society have ever done before. I'm gonna blame Twitter because people should do that more often, but also because it's turned figureheads into these relatable human beings that fans feel a greater amount of attachment towards. It's a really cool thing, but there is a danger with putting people on pedestals, as fans of half a dozen prominent YouTubers have found out since the start of the year. You don't even have to meet your heroes to be disappointed by them these days. Though, I guess it's worth mentioning that this is hardly a new phenomenon, as God's gift to game development John Romero demonstrated very aptly with Daikatana, or as it's known elsewhere in the world, the poorest man's doom. Because when you're involved in the creation of some of the biggest and most important FPS games in history, you do start to develop a bit of a reputation for having some kind of Midas touch when it comes to video game development. John Romero didn't try very hard to dispel his flourishing reputation for being this rock and roll game developer, and actively encouraged using this to build up hype for Daikatana, his new highly ambitious project away from id Software that will be using the engine from Quake to create this massive time-traveling adventure featuring more content than any game has ever seen before. Then id Software showed off their new Quake engine that made Daikatana look like a piece of crap, prompting a huge overhaul of the game and numerous delays, all while the marketing team pushed John Romero's appeal to breaking points, culminating in the ill-fated John Romero's about to make you his bitch advertisement that didn't go over well at all. All in all, Daikatana released as a very poorly optimized game years after its original release date, with the majority of its unique ideas being very badly realized and often working to the detriment of the game. Daikatana features AI companions that are promoted as a cool new thing, but are in fact worse than useless and often get themselves killed, resulting in a failed level. To be fair, the ad campaign wasn't lying about John Romero making players his bitch, since he was able to squeeze money out of fans who trusted his vision in return for a piece of crap video game. Clearly this was a good idea long term, since he's made sweet fuck all of note since then. Those pedestals will kill you, I'm telling you. Nintendo are a wild company sometimes. Their insistence on swimming against the tide has caused them a lot of self-inflicted trouble in the past, but when they've struck oil, it's given them a ton of success and made them a whole load of money. Their innovations have been very hit or miss throughout their history, and for every Wii and Switch, there's a Wii U and a Virtual Boy lurking just around the corner. For example, do you remember a time when the N64 had a microphone that you could speak into and slowly accept that this voice recognition technology is some way off being viable? I don't, but then I never owned Hey You Pikachu growing up. I do have an internet or two though. I imagine at some point Nintendo realised that they could use Pikachu to sell pretty much anything they wanted, and obviously you'll want to keep a bit of brand integrity, so maybe don't push out those Pikachu flavoured condoms, but anything else is probably fair game, as long as you don't do anything too crazy. I would consider Hey You Pikachu to be coming very close to straddling that line. So I think this is the biggest difference between a game being disappointing and a game falling over under the weight of its own ambition. Not even the most optimistic soul was looking at Hey You Pikachu and thinking, oh yeah, this game is going to be exactly what the N64 needs. It'll go down as an all-time classic. Move over Super Mario 64, there's a new sheriff in town. Because, conceptually, this is a terrible idea. Who wouldn't get titillated at the prospect of talking to Pikachu and seeing one of half a dozen facial expressions in response to whatever garbled noise you're throwing down this cheap microphone? He wouldn't understand me with my cold. It's a hard sell in its current state of using outdated 90s technology, but I can't be the only one who would love to see what the equivalent game would look like in 2019. Especially because I could then do my call to action thing where I say that if you've enjoyed this video and want to see more, then make sure you subscribe and hit that bell for notifications of every new upload, and then Pikachu would react like most of my viewers do every time I say that. Pikachu, I'm sorry. YouTube is a fucking minefield these days. I'm doing what I can. Hey You Pikachu was ahead of its time, but unfortunately the idea relied so much on competent technology that you start to notice fissure-like cracks in it nowadays. It resembles an episode of Dora the Explorer, and I kind of hate that. Go left, you fucking yellow prick! Maybe if Pokemon Sword and Shield do gangbusters for Game Freak, we can one day revisit the idea of Pikachu looking at me in an inquisitive way again. I'll make you proud, Pikachu. I promise. If you wanted to go deeper with this idea that a game can be too ambitious, I suppose the peak of that particular mountain would consist of a huge disparity between the developer's vision and the end result. Extreme ambition is saying, oh hey, what if we made a game that gave the player £1 million when they beat it and furiously fillets them every time they die? Or what about a game that's actually like 52 games in one? Or even something insane like, guys, we should try to make a good 3D Sonic game again. Ideas are never hard to come by, but realistic ideas? They're a little harder to conjure up sometimes. The difference is that one of those examples actually happened, and I'll give you a clue, it wasn't the Sonic one. There's a fascinating story behind Action 52 that ties into the expected narrative about bootleg games featuring dozens of unlicensed knockoffs of popular titles. Creator Vince Perry stated that he once saw his son playing with one of those illegal cartridges in the street and attracting quite the crowd. He decided to pursue a more legally sound version of this by seeing how many original games he could cram onto one cartridge. A task made immeasurably harder by Perry's lack of experience of video game design, resulting in bad recruitment, very short deadlines, and no real clue what he wanted to make. Just make lots of games and do it good? Action 52 is the worst game on this list by a long distance, but like Hey You Pikachu, it gets there by reaching too far and attempting to be something that it was never likely to be. Technically, Perry achieved what he set out to do and squeezed 52 games onto one cartridge, but every single one of them is of a really poor standard and not the sort of thing you'd spend more than 5 minutes on. A lot was pinned on cheetah men to carry this collection into the annals of history and to hopefully spawn an iconic franchise from the Cheetahmans. But it's just another crappy game buffeted on all sides by a ton of other crappy games. The deeper you dive, the more crazy stories you find, like music either being plagiarized from other games or written within 48 hours, and publicity angling towards Action 52 being a straight up scam, but you can't fault one man's wild ambition. Except for all the faults in it. This is RabbidLuigi, and while it's easy and fun to criticize Action 52 for being this ridiculous concept that naturally tripped over itself, I think it is admirable that this was even attempted in the first place. Admittedly, by someone who didn't know what they were doing, but it's still a wild idea and I have to celebrate that in some way. it's actually quite useful, because now the world knows that doing something like this is a really impossible idea, really bad idea. Not that the bootleggers ever paid attention to this, because years later, you can buy a console with 1,000 games on it. That's the sign of fucking progress right there. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below, because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.